Hey students, this is Mr. Moore, and I'm excited to be back with you to continue on our AP Euro review for the AP test. Every year that I've taught AP European history, I've always tried to provide students with the opportunity to review the content that they need that we've been studying all year. I have posted on my website all of the official study guides from the College Board for AP Euro. These official study guides are called Key Concepts, and that's what I'm going to be using as kind of the guiding document as we have this discussion here today. I'm going to break each of these lessons up into the individual topics. That way the videos are doable and manageable. I can't guarantee how long each one is going to be, but if you're looking for topic 1.1, that's on a previous video. Today I'm going to be covering here topic 1.2 on the Italian Renaissance. If at any time you'd like to quit this video and just open up the document itself and go through it at your own pace, you're welcome to do that. I would encourage you to Google search things that you read about, so you're not just reading it, because reading it doesn't equal learning. And that's one of the things we're trying to do today, is really help you to go deep into the content and understand the context as the backdrop. And that's what topic 1.1 was, the context to the Renaissance and this age of discovery. So I'm going to start right here. You can follow along with me. The first learning objective under topic 1.2, learning objective B says, explain how the revival of classical texts contributed to the development of the Renaissance in Italy. Again, I really like to use the map of Europe to make sure we all understand where we're talking about on the planet Earth. It's amazing how important geography is to the study of history. And if you're looking at the history of the world, the entire world, it goes back, written history goes back to before 3000 BC. It's essential to understand that somewhere around, 3,000, 200-ish, you can go Google this yourself, but somewhere about there in different parts of the world, writing was invented. And when writing is invented, that's when we can start to study history, because writing is what allows us to go back and to see what people were thinking and why people were doing things. And so out through the history of the world, different civilizations have recorded their histories. And in Italy, we can find a ton of stuff coming about during the 1300s AD, where people started to look back at the ancient writings of the Greeks and the Romans. And that's what we're talking about. So Greek civilization hit its height somewhere about 500 BC. That's not an exact date. I mean, some people would say that Greece hit its high point at about 320-ish, when Alexander the Great was conquering the known world. There are still giant cities throughout the Middle East area that have Alexander the Great's name on it. But classic Greece, or the golden age of Greece, with Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, you get writers like Homer and other things, like when he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Roman Republic existed. Rome places its founding 753-ish BC, and the Roman Republic transitions into the Roman Empire just after the birth of Christ. You have people like Julius Caesar and then Caesar Augustus, who start the Roman Empire, and that lasts all the way up until 400-ish AD. So from 500 AD until about 1300, 1400. Again, these are kind of rough dates, but we have this 1,000-year period where European countries are in what we might want to call the Middle Ages and or the medieval times, or the Dark Ages. And so when it says that we need to be able to explain the revival of classical texts, that means that these people who were living in Italy started to go back and study ancient Greek and Roman writers. It says Italian Renaissance humanists, including Petrarch, promoted a revival in classical literature and created new philosophical approaches to ancient texts. Some Renaissance humanists furthered the values of secularism and individualism. And what I'd like to do is to remind my students that in this class I provided for them a series of lectures in class. And in this section, we covered all of these important concepts on individualism, and we covered the concepts of what it meant to be the Middle Ages. I had 2 specific weeks full of information on them, and I'd remind my students to go back and to look at their notes. But when it comes to humanism, I tried to teach my students that humanism is placing more importance on human potential and human accomplishments rather than on, like, say, church doctrine. During medieval times, people focused so much on the religious part of life that they sometimes forgot to look at human accomplishments. And if you were living in Italy during this time, all you'd have to do is look in Rome at the Colosseum and see what the ancient people had done before you. Because people in medieval times, their architecture and their art and their writing was significantly less desirable and better than the people from the past. And so the people during the late medieval times started looking back at ancient Greek architecture and art and writing and saying, man, look at what these people before us were able to do. And so that's the general gist. And so when they start using humanist, they're talking about people who are looking at human accomplishments and not just at church things. It also used the word secularism and the word individualism. And again, I'd remind my students that we tried to teach them these concepts. Individualism, that idea that every individual person should be free to develop and pursue their own ideas and talents. And I think that's important. We live in an individualistic world where people are always promoting their name. YouTube and Facebook and any of these social media platforms, from TikTok to whatever the latest rave is on social media, is really exemplified in how we look at individualism today. And that's just like inborn and inbred in us. When I was teaching this class, during class, I probably brought up a concept of individualism. When you see a movie poster and the title of the movie is smaller than the actor who's the main star there, if it says something, like Mission Impossible 20, Tom Cruise, but the Tom Cruise is bigger than the title of the movie, that's like individualism, on steroids right there. And this is a slow process starting, during the Renaissance. And as I said in my part 1 on this history review, we have to remember that the Renaissance does not start in 1450. The reason this class starts in 1450 is because things start to speed up with the invention of the printing press. I'll remind students of what we tried to talk about in class, that the printing press is really what changes things. It's the printing press that pushes us forward and makes things move at a quicker pace. So even though these things were starting to develop, like secularism, separating ourselves from church dogma and church doctrine. And when I say church at this time, I'm really talking about the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was the dominant church in Western Europe. Okay, and at this point, an AP student, there should be things going on in the back of your mind. You should be like, oh yeah, I remember that at the end of the Roman Empire, Rome split itself into half. There was an eastern half and a western half, The eastern half was dominated from a city called Constantinople. Today it's called Istanbul. And the west half was still dominated by Rome. But the western half broke apart, fell apart. And this became medieval Europe, whereas the eastern half remained intact. And even though the people at that time would have referred to it as the Roman Empire, and historians refer to it as the Byzantine Empire. So those things are all going on in your head as an AP Euro student, especially when you're reviewing up for the AP test, those little things. If those things don't make sense, you need to pause, maybe go back to the notes, look at what we tried to learn, go through the notes again. They're always provided for you there and being updated with great videos there. But we'll continue on. This says learning objective C. It says explain the political, intellectual, and cultural effects of the Italian Renaissance. So here's the key. We're looking at the intellectual, okay, also some political and the cultural effects that stem out of this. Humanist revival of Greek and Roman text spread by the printing press challenged the institutional power of universities and the Catholic Church. This shifted education away from a primary focus on theological writings towards classical texts and new methods of scientific inquiry. It must be remembered that during medieval times, the Catholic Church controlled learning. I say that because most people were illiterate. There wasn't a lot of written stuff during medieval times available to regular people. If you were rich, you could have books in a library. If you were a Catholic monk, then you'd be trained to read and to write. And before the printing press, it must be remembered that you had to hand copy. If you wanted a book, a copy of a book, it would take you forever to sit down and to copy it word for word. I mean, if you've ever picked up like a Bible, and I mean Old Testament and New Testament, we're talking way over 1,000 pages. We're not just talking about reading that, but copying it word for word, line by line. That's what it was like during medieval times. So the printing press is going to change everything, and that's really one of the dominant reasons why this class picks up in 1450. And this starts to change people's ideas. They start once the printing press makes more literature available, people start to diverge away from. Remember, we just talked about this secularism. They start to break away from just studying church stuff, and breaking away from a primary focus on theological writings towards classical texts. And so, by studying classical text, people start to look at the world differently. And instead of just seeing things through the eyes of the Catholic Church or your Christian doctrine, they really start to change things. Admiration for Greek and Roman political institutions supported a revival of civic humanist culture in the Italian city-states and produced secular models for individual and political behavior. Just a reminder then, and I know, again, I'm going back to past notes that we've done, and I would encourage you to do this. Even though Italy is like a united country today, when 1450, when this class starts, in 1450, there's not a country of Italy. In fact, the country of Italy, like we think of it today, didn't happen until the 1800s, 1860s. That's like when Italy was unifying. And that's something we're going to study way later on. We're talking like Unit 7, okay? But remember that Italy is a collection of city-states and small kingdoms with different allegiances. And as people who were living in this Italian peninsula started to read the ancient text, they came across really great systems of government. I mean, the Roman Republic is still used as a model today. People still look at the old Roman Republic and see where it went wrong and try to compare it to modern day times and say, wow, how are we doing compared to the Romans? Please remember that the ruling body of the Roman Republic was called the Senate. And that's a word we still use in our government today, right? If you go to Washington, D.C., and you were to go, to the houses of Congress in Washington, D.C., you would actually find a building where is housed the U.S. Senate. Um, I think that's really important to recognize. I'm just zooming in here on the state capitol building, and you probably already know what it looks like. But there's one half for the House of Representatives and one house for the Senate. And that's what we're talking about. We still use a lot of the same political ideologies, that stem from the Romans and the Greeks. In class, we talked about the Greeks coming up with the idea of democracy. And when I say democracy with Greece, we're talking about direct democracy where everybody, well, if you weren't a slave and you weren't a woman, but you were a member of the ruling class, then you got a vote, direct democracy. And with the Roman Republic, of course, we're talking about representation in the Senate. And so as people started to study the ancient writings, they started to change their views on how things should work in Italy. It says in the Italian Renaissance, rulers and popes concerned with enhancing their prestige commissioned paintings and architectural works based on classical styles, the developing naturalism in the artistic world, and often the newly invented techniques of geometric perspective. So I'm going to jump over here for just a minute and try to remind you about geographic perspective. I'm going to go full screen here for a second because I think it will show up better. But as you're looking at this, is a painting by Raphael. And whether you realize what's going on here or not, there's something called linear perspective. And linear perspective puts one focal point on the vanishing point, they call it, a point on the picture. And they also have a horizon line so that as objects get smaller in the painting, it gives us the perception of depth. And that was certainly not something that was happening in medieval art. As I'll remind you, medieval art is very iconic. It's very flat. Objects that are bigger in medieval art are more important, not depth, closer to us. When you get into, like, say, Renaissance art, you get that depth perception, or you start to get very realistic paintings, sculptures, and architecture, all going back to that time period. And so that's what they're trying to say right here, that they were looking at paintings and architecture. And I guess here's the other thing that we're trying to point out, that even though there was secularism, and even though, it says the word secular multiple times in this document, and we need to understand that as a separation of stuff that's church and stuff that is not church, and that's what secular means, not church. That even though we're kind of separating it, the number one thing that's still being painted is church stuff. So as we went through this, I tried to remind my students that there's three basic themes in Renaissance art. One of the themes is Christianity, church stuff, glorifying God. So that's one of the themes. The other theme is what we would call, and here's just an example of church stuff like Da Vinci's Last Supper or the Sistine Chapel. Obviously, and there's paintings of like Mary, like the Madonna, right? Again and again and again. But one of the other things that often comes up besides church stuff, besides Christian stuff, besides the Catholic Church stuff, is ancient Greek and Roman mythology. When you get some of the paintings, and I'm just going to bring this up right here, Botticelli is one of those guys who's going to give us a lot of non-Christian stuff, things that go back and harken back to Greek and Roman mythology. The third thing, then, as a reminder, is portraits and landscapes and that naturalism in the artistic world. Now, in this key concepts, what the College Board has done for us is they've given us a list of people that we should be familiar with, people that we could use as examples when we're doing our writing. In everything that we do in our writing, we're really striving to do three things. We're going to make a claim, we're going to back it up with evidence, and then we're going to tie that all together with logic and reasoning. Those are skills that the College Board is going to test students on. And so what we're doing right here is now we're providing students with some great pieces of evidence, something they could tuck in their head and say, oh, that's a great example of this. So right here it says illustrative examples of the period. So for Italian Renaissance humanists, if you were going to use an example, here's some of the examples you could use. The first one is Petrarch. And even though he really lived before the 1450, when this class starts, he's really seen as the father of humanism. He's an Italian writer and poet, the father of humanism. Humanism being the idea that man is the measure of all things. He revitalized people's interest in the classics when he rediscovered the forgotten writings of Cicero. Cicero, of course, being one of the great, political leaders in Rome, and also a great writer and orator. Right there at the end of the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, when it's falling apart and becoming the Roman Empire. So I'll restate that again. At the end of the Roman Republic, when Julius Caesar and Pompey and all those guys, Crassus, who are in a way just destroying the old Roman Republic, and it's going to be reborn as the Roman Empire, Cicero's there. And so he's seen as one of the greats. Lorenzo Valla is an Italian priest, so he's Catholic, but he's also a humanist whose knowledge of classical text was used to prove some important documents as forgeries. So I don't want to get too complicated into this, but back in Roman times, when the Roman Emperor Constantine divided Europe in half, basically. He divided the Roman Empire in half. I do have some stuff that you might want to go back and look at on previous notes that we have. I particularly spent some time talking about this, and you can go back and look at my notes if you want deeper interest in this. But one of the things that you need to understand is that I'm going to open up some different slideshows just so when I want to make reference to them, you can go and check them out. You can see that I'm in this video right here covering just some of the first weeks of the notes that we've done. But this guy right here, he found this document that said that the Emperor Constantine had given the Catholic Church the rights to be the successors to the Roman Empire. That's the simple version of it. So if so basically the Catholic Church was saying, hey, we have proof that Rome, the Roman Empire. So here's some of my pictures here. If you remember, here's the old Roman Empire. It encompassed North Africa, the Middle East, part of Asia, and most of Europe. And remember that Constantine, he divided Rome into a western and eastern half, and he kept the eastern half for himself because that was the richer side, all the stuff coming in from Asia. Remember, Asia is like the grand prize in this entire class. He also changed the capital city from Rome over to Byzantium. And, of course, the Huns and Germanic tribes come in and destroy Western Rome. And that's why it becomes medieval times over here in the West, and the Byzantine Empire remains in the East. And what this document was supposed to say is that the Emperor Constantine granted the Catholic Church the rights to be the successors to the Roman Empire. However, when this guy Valla was reading through it, he came across words that the ancient Romans wouldn't have used. And the writing style wouldn't have been used by the ancient Romans. And so he was able to show and to prove that the document was a forgery. It's like if somebody was trying to create a document from the 1800s, and they started to use the words like, oh, that's totally gnarly and radical, and like, oh man, that's totally not cool. Like anybody who grew up in the 80s would be like, people didn't use the word radical or gnarly back in the 1800s. That's totally a 1980s lingo. If they're talking about things like Rubik's Cubes, and this document was supposed to be from the 1800s, anybody with half a brain would be like, hey, that's not accurate. That's obviously a forgery. So that's my little modern version to try to explain what he's doing here. But he's using his ability to look at documents and to be able to pull evidence out and say, look, obviously this is a forgery. The Catholic Church wasn't given particular things from the Emperor Constantine. Even though he's a Catholic priest, he's not bagging on the Catholic Church. He's just saying, hey, look, this document is obviously not true. All right, here's some other examples right here. Ficino, right? And again, I'm not the best at pronouncing Italian names. I don't speak Italian. But Maurizio Ficino is an Italian writer and a humanist who translated the works of Plato into Latin for the first time. There's really a few ancient Greek philosophers that you should know. One of the best and first was Socrates. And Socrates, his best student was a dude named Plato. And then Plato's best student was a dude named Aristotle. So Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And if you go beyond that, Aristotle, I would say one of his best students was Alexander the Great, the guy who conquered all the known world back then. But Aristotle was generally seen as one of the best in the ancient world, and people had been studying his writings for centuries, even way after he was dead, and for a millennia. So even during medieval times, like the Dark Ages, people were still reading Aristotle. Even though Aristotle, it turns out, was wrong with a lot of things, at the time he was generally considered like one of the best of the best. And so his works had already been translated into Latin. Little side note, a reminder that Latin is the ancient language of the Romans. And so Aristotle had already been widely read and used during medieval times, but Plato had kind of been ignored and maybe, I guess a little forgotten about. And so this guy translated Plato into Latin, from Greek into Latin, so people would have more scholarly and academic access to it. The other guy right here is Pico della Mirandola, and he wrote the Oration on the Dignity of Man, in which he promotes the idea of free will. The idea of free will has a major influence on the Renaissance ideas of humanism and individualism. So again, if you go back to some of the writings or some of the lecture notes and materials that have been provided for you in class that theoretically we did a good job covering in class, we do have information on him. He was hired by the Medici family, great intellect. He did a lot of reading in ancient languages. That's one thing that's important with all of these Renaissance writers and scholars, is they like to read things in the original language. So if they're going to read Plato, the truth is most people would want to go back and read Plato in Greek, because Plato's Greek. So the fact that he translated it into Latin is allowing people who aren't so scholarly to have access to it. If somebody who was a Renaissance scholar wanting to study things from the Bible, they would want to go back and read the Old Testament in Hebrew, because that's the original language. Or they'd want to read the New Testament in Greek, because that's the original language of the New Testament. The apostles of Jesus wrote most of this stuff in Greek, because in Europe, in the western half, the dominant language was the lingua franca, right? The dominant language here would have been Latin, whereas over here in the east side it would have been Greek. So the Byzantines used Greek, whereas the Western Europeans, even after the fall of Rome, would continue to use Latin as their dominant language of scholarliness. So that did limit people's ability to get access to things. Here's a few more individuals promoting secular models for individual and political behavior. Niccolò Machiavelli, is probably one of the most well-recognized people when it comes to the Renaissance. We spent a good deal of time, at least I tried to, in class talking about Machiavelli. He's the dude who wrote that book, The Prince, and it's kind of a how to rule a country for dummies kind of a book. Really what it is he's trying to get people to be effective leaders. And what you need to know about Machiavelli is he's not so concerned about what's right and wrong so much as he is concerned with what is effective. That's the key right there. And he used in his writings Roman leaders. He used Greek philosophical ideas, and he even used biblical examples. So he's not scared to use Christian examples, but he's not trying to talk to people about, believing in Jesus and, forgiving their sins and all that kind of stuff. He's interested in saying, here's what effective leaders do. And so Machiavelli, an Italian humanist and political writer who used ideas from Greek and Roman classics along with contemporary examples when he wrote The Prince, a guidebook on how to acquire and maintain power, rule in a country, be a statesman, etc. Right? So he's definitely one of the best political writers of the time. Baltasar Castiglione is an Italian writer famous for The Book of the Courtier, which teaches young men how to live by civic virtue and how to be the ideal Renaissance man. We could add even in there, he wants people to be a polymath. He wants people to learn. He says that the most important thing that a young man should be educated in is the classics. And by reading the classics, they'll learn this concept of civic virtue. Not virtue like this is morally right and wrong, and if you do this, you're going to go to hell. But civic virtue is more based on Roman ideals. So fortitude and ambition, right? It's not talking about what's right and wrong morally, like we do in Christian churches, but teaching people the ideals of Roman values. Okay. The next one right here is a friend and critic of Machiavelli. Okay. Guicciardini, became famous for his use of government sources to support arguments and the realistic analysis of people and events of his time. When I said that Machiavelli also used contemporary examples, one of his friends was talking about the governments that were going on in Italy during the life of, say, Machiavelli. Remember, Italy is this conglomeration of different political entities. Some are kingdoms, some are republics, some are duchies, right? Even the papal states are literally controlled by the Pope. Right? That's like the Pope's country. Today, the Pope's country is ridiculously small. Just for emphasis sake, we're going to zoom in on the city of Rome today in Google Maps. And inside the city of Rome is the Pope's country. He has his own country called Vatican, or sometimes referred to as the Holy See, or Vatican City. And you could walk across it. It's like a mile wide. I mean, well, look at this down here, and this it says like 2,000 feet across, so it's way under a mile. You could walk across it, depending on your speed of walking in a few minutes. But he's using all this political dynamics of the time to try to help teach people about what good and effective government is. He also, of course, is working with Machiavelli, and so all these scholars are using Greek and Roman and even biblical examples in their writings, but he was particularly focused on the governments and things that were going on during his time. Now, individuals promoting a revival of Greek and Roman text, Leonardo Bruni, may be considered the first modern historian. He created the historical ideas of antiquity versus the Middle Ages versus the time period he was living on. And he pointed out that the Renaissance was the beginning of a new era. I don't think that we could overemphasize this. Here's my little timeline as a visual aid. you can see that the Greeks hit their high point during this Jesus time, right? The BC stands for before Christ. Okay, the Romans, the Republic of Rome. The Republic of Rome was founded even back here in 753 BC. But the Romans started to hit the peak of their power close to the 0 mark, when Jesus was born. And even though Eastern Rome, the Byzantine Empire, goes all the way until like the 1450s when this class starts. So to put just the Romans right here is maybe not entirely accurate, but for the purposes of understanding the Middle Ages is from around 500 AD to around, 1500 AD. And this little box right here, the Renaissance, is showing you that the Renaissance definitely overlaps the end of the Middle Ages. So if you were growing up during the Renaissance, you probably wouldn't have known that something else was happening. But this guy right here, Bruni, he kind of came up with this idea of there being an ancient world, a medieval or Middle Ages, and then pointing to the Renaissance. And I really like to point out to students why that's so significant that we call it the Middle Ages is because we have the actual Greeks and Romans beforehand, and then we have the rebirth of Greek and Roman stuff, and in between that we call it the Middle Ages. Leon Battista Alberti was an Italian. So again, last names are almost always what we use, Alberti. There are a couple of exceptions. For instance, up here, when we talk about Pico della Mirandola, we almost use Pico. That's kind of what we do. But like, say, Machiavelli, Castiglione, these are the guys we almost always use their last name. So Alberti is an Italian humanist, example of a polymath. A polymath is somebody who's good at everything, right? It says right here, author, artist, architect, poet, priest, linguist, philosopher, right? He is a Renaissance man. In class, we watched a little video on this guy here, Alberti, and he was great. He was trying to be involved in the reconstruction of a dome in Florence, but he ended up not being the guy to get the job. That's going to go to a guy named Brunelleschi. We'll get to him in just a minute. But Alberti and Brunelleschi were kind of like rivals, and Brunelleschi is going to come out on top and actually do the dome, the famous dome in Florence. That's one of the great architectural examples of this new age, harkening back to the old. Here I put Niccolò Machiavelli is an example of a revival of Greek and Roman text, but I'm not going to tell you more about him because we already did. So if you ever see in here where it says repeat, I've already talked about him. So painters and architects, Michelangelo is perhaps one of the most famous Italian painters and sculptors. He's from Florence. If I jump over here to our map of Italy, I think it might be worth pointing out that this is Florence, and this whole area in here is called Tuscany. The Etruscans came from this area, if you're famous for old school like Roman history. But this whole area is called Tuscany, and you probably the famous Leaning Tower of Pisa over here. And Florence is one of the hotbeds for the Italian Renaissance. So a lot of the dudes come from Florence, although they come from all over Italy, and later they're going to come from other parts of Europe. It should be pointed out that he's definitely from there. He's famous for his painting of the Sistine Chapel, his statue of David and the Pietà. And I did have a couple of some of those artworks available for you to look at. Like this right here is the Pietà, where Jesus has just been pulled off of the cross. And in the other one, when we were talking about Italian art, we also mentioned some of the famous artists, right? I compared them to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles because that's the name of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Made a little joke of it. But Michelangelo, Donatello, Raphael, and Leonardo. as kind of a way to remember some of the most famous painters. Donatello actually was quite a bit before Michelangelo. He was one of the early Renaissance artists. He's an Italian artist who made the first freestanding nude of the biblical hero David. So most people are familiar with, like, say, Michelangelo's David statue, but Donatello also does one. And maybe at the end I'll pull up my European art lesson. If I could just do that real quick, because I'm going to make reference to it several times, especially during the Renaissance. If you come here to the very bottom, there's different resources, and if you click on, it said European, I'll go back to here, it says European Art History Lesson. It's a slideshow with all of the famous artists and time periods, and so I'm gonna be making reference to this all the time, and it goes through like Byzantine art. It kind of shows you some of the early, like even before this class started, Byzantine art. It shows you Gothic art, which Gothic is medieval. If you ever hear the word Gothic, think medieval. Okay, it's not very lifelike. It's very iconic, and like this is, of course, Le Notre Dame de Paris, probably the most famous Notre Dame cathedral. And if you're like, what do you mean the only Notre Dame? That's the only one. No. If you go to almost any city in France, you'll find like a Notre Dame de whatever city you're in. This is the most famous one, and it has these flying buttresses that's totally Gothic in its symbolism. A great example of Gothic art style. Again, this is the end of medieval art. You can see the dates right there before this class starts, but it kind of gives you some context. With early Renaissance art, you start to see some life, very realistic. This is Donatello's David. That's why I brought this up. This is his David statue. It's a freestanding nude. And if we got into, like, I'm going to jump down here to Michelangelo's David for just a second. Michelangelo's David is probably the most famous, but Donatello came before him. So that gives you a little look at it. And of course, the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel is an entire painting. The entire ceiling and walls of the chapel in Vatican City. You can go there as a tourist and check it out. But it's beautiful and brilliant. The entire thing was done by Michelangelo, and so that's why I thought I'd just talk about him and Donatello. Raphael, I've already shown his painting of that School of Athens. Right here, I'll read this here. It says, an Italian painter of the High Renaissance known for his School of Athens painting, which uses linear perspective to add depth and reality to his work while depicting the ancient Greek philosophers of Plato and Aristotle. And so, not to rehash it all, but you got Plato and Aristotle along with himself. So he's kind of pretending like he's back there with the original guys, a couple hundred years before his lifetime. And he's using that linear perspective. So great stuff right there. Andrea Palindo, Italian architect who is widely considered to be one of the most influential individuals in the history of architecture. His buildings are seen throughout Venice, Italy. So I'm going to zoom in here to Venice. It's a great place. You watched Spider-Man Homecoming. You saw a little bit of Venice. But it really is just a conglomeration of islands and canals throughout this city. And back in the day, now they've got like modern bridges and stuff, but it's almost like a floating city out there on these marshy islands, and you've got all of the canals going through it. And Venice controlled the entire area up here. Places far inland would be influenced by Venice. If it's worth our time, one more time I'll show you this map of. You could see that Venice would have controlled a giant chunk of Italy during this time, and this guy is one of the best architects known for there. Again, there is a repeat on a few. The last one we'll talk about in this section right here is Filippo Brunelleschi, an Italian architect whose most famous work was a freestanding dome on the cathedral in Florence. In designing the dome, he parted from the Gothic medieval use of buttresses and returned to the classic methods of antiquity. And so I'd like to take just a second and show you this freestanding dome. This again, I'm going full screen mode. Hopefully it shows up better. This is medieval or Gothic with the flying buttresses, and this is the freestanding dome. Nothing's supporting it. We watched a whole video in class of this Duomo in Florence, and Filippo Brunelleschi, an architect and engineer and pioneered a lot of Renaissance architecture, and he actually went down to Rome and studied for quite a long time there in Rome, and looking at some of the old Roman domes. So this is the end of this section. I'm going to come back here to the very top just one more time. This is topic 1.2, the Italian Renaissance, and this is Mr. Moore signing off. Till next time.